agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Joining me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Matheny. Hey, Kristen.
Hey, Mike. Happy Independence Day.
Yeah, happy Independence Day to you. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing okay. I'm tired. The show went on pretty late last night. And, we were talking about before we got started that, some people in our neighborhoods respectively started the fireworks show a little early. So made for a late night, but I'm tired, but okay.
Oh, I don't get that. I said to my wife, what's going on with some people? It was like 1:30 and someone decided to do their own impromptu fireworks show. And I thought, I hope maybe they were, I don't know, drunk or doing some kind of bizarre sort of, gesture of, oh, Mildred, will you marry me? And look at all this wonderful thing. And, I don't know, something. I want there to be some reason aside from somebody just being an inconsiderate jackass, I guess, I hope that's the case.
Well, hopefully Mildred got her proposal.
That's what I'd like to think anyway. But yeah, that was crazy. We are recording on Independence Day, which is, I think a first for us. And as I was saying to you, it would be weird to not talk about that, because I was thinking about that last night as I was preparing the show, as you were too, I know you said. And to me, it's interesting in sort of a sad way, is that we are probably less free now because of what's going on than we've been in any Independence Day, well, in my lifetime, certainly. And that will just be a temporary thing. But, I was also thinking about the nature of this, this reduction in our freedom. And of course, we're doing it, to protect others. And then that made me think about, well, the sight, the spectacle of the president's Mount Rushmore rally. And whenever I see a big crowd, regardless of whether it's at a rally or a protest, and I see a bunch of people who are packed together without masks, and I just think, wow, that's not a good thing. And there's a part of me that keeps on thinking, I heard the Fox Business interview with President Trump this week, where he said, I'm actually for masks and I don't have to wear one because I'm the president and people around me get tested. I was like, okay, that's fine. And there's a part of me that keeps on hoping he's going to make this big gesture and go out in a crowd and say, look at this, I'm putting a mask on. And I would like you to all do that now. Wow, what an example that would be. Because, Mitch McConnell or Marco Rubio or whatever can say whatever they want. But, it's President Trump is the one who I think people would really sort of respect. And I think when people see the president and the president's crowd with no masks and no social distancing, it sends a pretty powerful message. And I can't help but be continually disappointed at that.
Well, I guess, first of all, I just want to say, I don't know how many listeners we have in South Dakota, but South Dakota is actually one of my family's favorite places. We've talked about possibly moving there someday. We really, I love my home state of Florida. Yeah, but South Dakota is an exceptionally beautiful place. We love the culture up there. We love, the natural setting. And Mount Rushmore is probably, and I'm not exaggerating, one of the most beautiful and awe-inspiring places I've ever been to. It's just, even beside the monument itself, the Black Hills are just beautiful. They're breathtaking. They're pristine. And so, when I heard that this was happening at Mount Rushmore, on a personal level, I was really excited because we had this incredible visit to Mount Rushmore and this incredible visit to South Dakota about a year and a half ago. My whole family had an amazing time. And, I know that we'll get into kind of the politics of COVID and the mask mandates and everything. I know that that's, on our roster of things to talk about. But, I guess my opinion has changed so much over the last 3 months. I guess we're all sitting at home, we're working from home, we're trying to make do. I hate using the phrase new normal. It drives me crazy, but it really is sort of a new normal. And like you said, it is temporary, but it's given me a lot of time to think about all of these mask mandates and, outrage over, people not wearing masks. And I guess my overarching concern is really about the economy. And, this 4th of July just for me feels weird because we are less free because of COVID, but also because I can't help but think about all the people that I know who have lost their businesses, who are having to stay home from work, who aren't working, who aren't making money, who are in these really dire financial straits. And a lot of them have rebounded to some extent. Some people have, gotten their jobs back. Some companies have started rehiring, but I guess with the threat of something like this happening again, that's sort of my overarching concern. I think a lot of Republicans have it right to advocate for the mask wearing. I think if there's, I'm not 100% convinced that it's like a silver bullet, that it's going to be this this magical wand that keeps people from getting COVID. But I think if it helps, then we should be doing it. And if only because I don't want to see what happened in March, where the economy completely shut down, happen again. I just have too much pain in my heart for people who my family suffered. Our financial situation suffered over those months, and it's starting to come back. But I just really feel for like single parents and people who are having to, make adjustments to their lives, possibly not send their kids to school in the fall. And so, I look around and I think to myself, what do we want? Are we cool wearing masks and not gathering, or are we cool shutting down the economy again? And I guess, maybe that's a more conservative approach, but I guess I'm putting the economy over the mask wearing in terms of importance.
Well, I guess I'm sort of trying to wrap my head around that, because it doesn't seem to me it's an either or. I mean, Goldman Sachs, which is certainly no radical left-wing sort of communist organization, right? Goldman Sachs is sort of like the exemplar of American capitalism. Their research this week basically said, hey, wearing masks could actually have a huge impact, a positive impact on GDP, and that they.
Oh no, I agree with you on this. I probably didn't explain the correlation. I agree with you on this. I think that if people were to wear masks, if it were to prevent the disease and to prevent the possible closure of businesses and schools and things like that, I think it's a good thing. Yeah, I probably didn't explain that.
And so I guess that's why I'm so puzzled, because it seems to me that in not sort of setting an example and sort of modeling this sort of behavior, that the president is actually, it's not just a political statement, but it also causes, both economic and economic harm. And of course, it leads to more infections and more deaths. And so I'm just puzzled why the president of the United States, whoever that person is, wouldn't take a cost-free symbolic action that would almost certainly save lives and help to improve the economy. It's just, I don't understand that at all. Do you?
No, and I would take it even a step farther. So there are a lot of Republicans, I'm not going to say politicians, because I think there are a lot of Republicans in office who have advocated for the wearing of masks and face coverings. I know in Florida, both Senators Rick Scott, Marco Rubio have advocated for it. I mean, even Governor Ron DeSantis has advocated for it, although he's had some policies that cite otherwise. But I would take it a step farther, and I would say that activists who, now I think there are some legitimate reasons for obviously for not wearing the mask if you're exercising outside, if you're a small child, or you have small children, if you have breathing problems. I mean, obviously there are exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, I think looking back in recent history to the last 3 months, our economy was completely shuttered. And that was because COVID numbers were spiking, and now we're in a situation where they're spiking again. And it makes me angry as a Republican when I see Republican activists, kind of pointing to this and saying, well, forget all of this. I'm not going to wear a mask. If it stops the spread of disease, and I think scientifically, there are some loopholes and there's some, conflicting evidence, but for the most part, most, of the medical community agrees that that these masks do at some point stop the spread of this disease. If it stops the spread of the disease, and if it means saving the economy and saving lives, I'll put on a mask. I'll do my part. I'll put on a mask. I don't think, I don't feel like a sheep. I don't, so yeah, I do wish the president would pop a mask on his face, just to, and I wish other Republicans would do the same, because I think it sends a message that you're not taking this economic downturn seriously. And I understand where they're coming from. I do understand where they're coming from, but I think, we're looking at things, we're looking at the harsh reality of the fact that we may have, spikes, and this may happen again. I think we should all have a mask. I think we should wear it when we're in public, obviously, unless you're exercising or you have some, pre-existing condition. And I think that should be the end of it. If it means saving the economy, then it means saving the economy. And that's kind of where I stand.
Yeah, because it seems to me that most other prominent Republicans have actually come around to that view, and I have no problem saying it. In fact, even on the president's presumably still somewhat favored news source, Fox News and Fox and Friends, or the host saying, everyone should wear a mask, and Sean Hannity advocating for mask wearing. And yet, and I don't, I always think psychoanalysis at a distance, especially, hey, I'm not that kind of doctor, but it seems to me that President Trump, once he stakes out a position, it is more difficult for him to pull back from a position than maybe your typical politician. And I think maybe on some level, it seems to me that he would feel that being in a mask now would be some sort of capitulation or sign of weakness. And my sense is that more than most other politicians, I would say, President Trump is deeply concerned about appearing weak. And despite what all the positive ramifications would be of his leadership on this issue, I feel that his concern that this would make him appear weak and backing down actually overrides both the economic and public health benefits that might come from that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that I understand the idea that this should be something that is affected state by state, and it is something, and I understand that the argument that mandating masks on a federal level would be, would probably not be something that he would ever do, nor would it be completely constitutional. But we are dealing with a situation that we haven't had to deal with before. People love to bring up like swine flu and bird flu and H1N1, H1N1, all these other pandemics that have, I guess, happened during at least my lifetime, my adult life. And we also didn't have the benefit of, as big a 24-hour news cycle. It also things weren't as politicized as they are now. But I think now, we all have access to masks. Most places I've been have masks free for the taking. They're a lot more accessible than they once were. I think that in terms of just, doing your part, helping the economy, the mask has never bothered me. I've never felt like a sheep. I've never felt like it makes me any weaker to wear a mask. When I went and visited my grandmother in a nursing home, I had to wear. Obviously, if you go to a hospital and you're sitting in the ER waiting room, you're handed a mask to wear. I think it makes sense. But this president is obviously, like you said, very much affected by his perceived, I guess, sense of weakness and how other people perceive him. We're in an election year. This issue's been so heavily politicized. And I think once an issue like this or any other issue becomes heavily, heavily politicized, like you said, he takes a stand and he sticks with that stand. And I think that there's a certain group of Republicans that has also adopted this stance, and they're looking at him as justification. And in a situation like this, he should be putting pressure on governors to, sort of mandate the mask wearing, and certainly local, more local officials, county leadership, city leadership, to mandate the mask wearing. But I mean,
yeah, I agree on that part. Like when I give Governor Abbott in Texas their credit for finally doing what I felt was the right thing for mandating
Yeah.
masks for counties with more than 20 cases. And, it wouldn't have cost the president much to just basically send out a tweet saying, good for Governor Abbott, taking care of his people, that sort of thing. But that, again, I think he just sees that as sort of a nod toward capitulation. And so, some politicians are better at building consensus and that sort of thing. And some politicians, that's just not their thing. And that's not who Donald Trump is as a human being. And so it would be weird to expect him to just change who he is as a person. He's gotten to the point that he's gotten, which is a pretty impressive point, by being a certain way and by highlighting, put it charitably, by highlighting differences. And that's not going to change now, and that's just really too bad. I will say on this that I think there is something to be said for the view on the right that, hey, this is definitely bad. There's no question. And when you take a look at how we're doing in terms of bending the curve or crushing the curve in terms of a lot of other rich countries, it's not very good at all. But they're also saying, well, it's not like things in Houston aren't, for instance, like things were in New York City. And that's true for right now. But of course, what we've learned about this virus is things can get really bad really quick. And so I do think sometimes that, this is it can be overplayed because we always look at worst case scenarios. But given the severe ramifications, I think it's important not to just poo-poo this thing, because too many people see that and just say, oh, well, yeah, we don't really have to worry about it because our deaths aren't that bad or something like that. And I just think that's not a good way to look at it.
Yeah, as I was researching this, I have a good friend who's a doctor. She's actually, she's the co-director of the COVID response at a big sort of local chain of hospitals here in South Florida. And I talked to her a lot because when all this began, she was sort of my I guess resource on the ground level, because it's if you don't know somebody, or if you don't know a lot of people who are in the medical community, but if you don't know somebody who's actually involved in the COVID response, obviously, I think it goes without saying, it's very hard to get a straight story from the news. Either, if you're watching left-leaning sources, right-leaning sources, it's so hard right now to get a straight story and a timeline and to understand what's really going on. And from the beginning, and again, this isn't necessarily an excuse, but I think it explains where a lot of the frustration comes from on the right and on the left to some extent too. From the beginning, she expressed concern about the way COVID was being reported in the news, and she said it's not so much the data that's coming from hospitals and the data that's coming from these, from the CDC and the World Health Organization. It's the way that numbers are being conflated. And, she acknowledged, she's by no means a Republican, but she acknowledged from the start that there were issues with it and that there were legitimate questions that needed to be asked. And I don't think a lot of people disagreed with that. But the issue is that I think over time, this has been compounded and compounded and compounded, and it's led to even more distrust of the media, both on the right and on the left. Are we, blowing it out of proportion in one direction, or are we, dismissing it too quickly in the other direction? And it's led to this, I don't want to call it fatigue, but that seems to be what it is, where we've sort of adopted these ideas a long time ago and we're set in our ways. And I think this is what Donald Trump is going through right now. I think this is what a lot of people on the right and left are going through right now. And the truth is that just in terms of policy, this is something that's very, very fluid, and these numbers change every day. And when you combine sort of this mistrust of the media and, some of the inaccuracies in reporting on, whether you're watching CNN, Fox News, it seems so heavily politicized. It's hard to take the threat seriously one way or the other. And so what I'm finding frustrating is having to sift through sources to find actual data. And again, I know I've brought this up on the show before, but sometimes when I'm trying to find a timeline or I'm trying to find numbers, actual concrete numbers, where I can, sort of formulate an opinion, this is becoming harder and harder and harder the longer this draws on. So I feel like, most of us looking from the outside in, I'm not part of the medical community, but talking to her and hearing her frustrations really drives home a lot of those points. And again, it's not an excuse necessarily, but I think it explains why why we are where we are right now, and why there's so much back and forth, and why people are frustrated in either direction.
Yeah, there definitely are a lot of frustrated people all over the place. That's for sure.
Sure.
Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we take a break from COVID for, let's get radical, the entire rest of the episode? You think we can do that?
I think we could do that. Fatigue has set in, I guess.
Yeah, I think maybe even with listeners, but we have so many other things to talk about as well, and I actually thought we were going to lead with this, but it was kind of a natural segue into the masks and COVID thing. But the whole big thing this week about Russian bounties, right?
Yeah. So again, this was another one of these stories that was hard to get. It was hard to get a timeline. I just wanted a basic timeline of how this broke down, and it was so hard to find. Very, very difficult. So going back to January of this year, we'll start at the beginning of this year, even though this issue goes back a couple of years. In January of this year, the New York Times reported that U.S. intelligence officers began to warn their superiors about a suspected plot among Russian intelligence officials to pay bounties to these Afghan militias for killing U.S. and coalition troops. So that's kind of where this all begins. And fast forward to June, there were, some things that happened. The Navy SEAL Team 6 discovered $500,000 during a Taliban raid, and the Taliban obviously was claiming responsibility for killing U.S. troops. This has been going on for a couple of years. So anyway, fast forward to late June, the New York Times reported about a Russian plot, and that the U.S. intelligence community and the Trump administration had been debating how to handle these reports. And this obviously caused a stir. The White House quickly denied that the president had been briefed on this issue, and also claimed that the Vice President Pence, had also not been briefed on this issue about bounties paid for, bounties on U.S. troops and coalition troops' heads paid for by Russians to members of the Taliban. And so initially, the White House said that they would not comment on intelligence reports or internal deliberations. And so then this past week, everything's sort of hit the fan, and things have been a bit chaotic. Biden and Trump are launching attacks and counterattacks over this. Democrats have accused the president of knowing about the suspected plot and demanding briefings from the intelligence community. Trump called it a hoax. Republicans claim there was no consensus within the intelligence community. The plot could not be verified. Several officials close to the president claim they were not aware. And now Adam Schiff has sort of gotten involved. There are now questions surrounding how much Adam Schiff knew. He's the chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and when he knew it. So we've sort of devolved into another chaotic mess. And with everything going on right now, it just seems like this is something we need to be paying attention to and talking about. And I'm sure you have some opinions about it, Mike.
Yeah. I my first thought was when a report comes out that Russians may or may not have, but may possibly have been putting out bounties on American troops. The initial word from the White House, I don't think should be, from the president, shouldn't be, no one told me. I think that's just, wow, incredibly puzzling. I would say that the initial response should have been just the opposite. Even if the president were briefed, not being in the loop, or an impression that you're not in the loop on something that's apparently important enough where we told some of our allies about it, that makes you sound weak and ineffectual. So I think the response should have been, we were absolutely aware of this. It's unverified intelligence, but if we find out that this actually did happen, we are going to hit back hard, and here are the sort of things we're going to do. But instead, we got a very opposite response, which is puzzling to me again, because this would be a perfect opportunity for Donald Trump to demonstrate that he's not in any way beholden to Russia or Putin or anything like that. And we know that's a big concern of his. So that the response just seems to me to be the administration or the president kind of shooting himself in the foot here. I wasn't briefed. That's wow. Well, then if you weren't briefed, that maybe there's a problem with your briefers, or, I don't know, but it sure sounds like something you should have been briefed about if we briefed the UK about it.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions sort of involving how this all went down, and both the Republican and the Democrat responses to it, because, obviously I knew as soon as this story started, I guess, foaming up in the media, I started to look at Adam Schiff, and I thought to myself, he's obviously got to come out and say something. Initially, he said he had no comment. Then he came out and he denied it. He also, expressed that he hadn't been briefed. And then all of a sudden it became this big political issue. And then Donald Trump said that he hadn't been briefed. He called it a hoax. I personally would hold both sides responsible. I think that what's happened here is that there was probably some preemptive reporting on the part of the New York Times, which doesn't surprise me when it comes to the New York Times. They're fans of jumping the gun on a lot of these, especially reporting on intelligence issues. And, it sort of felt like maybe they were in the midst of trying to come to a decision. I know people on both sides mentioned that the intelligence they had wasn't actionable, and so no decision had been made yet. All of a sudden, they were sort of both sides were caught with their pants down, and so there was this struggle, especially on Monday going into Tuesday, on both sides of people saying, "Well, I'm not going to comment on that." But instead of saying I didn't know about it, and then all of a sudden turning it into this political issue, I wish that both sides had owned up to it and not immediately turned it into a political issue. And it felt like all of a sudden it became a campaign issue. It shouldn't have been. It probably should have been something that needed to be looked into, and they needed to present a united front on that. But I think that's asking too much during this election year and at this time. I had wished for different responses on both sides, I guess. And I didn't get it. Yeah.
I think that's a reasonable response, but also I would point out that the President of the United States is the President of the United States, and there's a big difference between being in that position and the responsibility for national security and responding to threats than someone who's chairing a House committee. And so I think there's a danger, certainly where we can recognize that both sides responded in a way that we would not necessarily have liked to see in a more perfect world. I also think there's the danger of a false equivalence, because the president is the primary person responsible for this. It's his national security briefings. He's the one who gets the brief. He's the one who picks the staff. That's a very different situation from someone like Adam Schiff or any Democrat that you could name, strictly by the fact that the president is the president. And so you can acknowledge, well, okay, maybe Adam Schiff's response was not great, but the primary response we need to be concerned about is that of the President of the United States, because he's the guy on this. And so that's my concern, is that it's too easy to turn this into both sides didn't do the right thing. I mean, Donald Trump's the President of the United States, and he has a heightened responsibility, certainly far more than Adam Schiff does in these matters.
I guess it feels disingenuous when you have a situation where multiple people on both sides weren't briefed. I don't think that this is necessarily creating a false equivalency where you have multiple people, Democrats, Republicans, high-level officials, the President of the United States, who may or may not have been briefed, who may have been briefed on this, but maybe they were told that this wasn't actionable yet. They were still trying. A lot of these stories coming out of the Middle East haven't been verified yet. A lot of the claims that this money, paid to Taliban may or may not have come from Russia. I mean, nothing can be verified. But I feel like it feels disingenuous when initially Democrats come out and say, well, we're not going to comment on that. This is a developing story. And some even admit that they hadn't been fully briefed and that, nothing had been actionable. And then all of a sudden it becomes this blown up, hyper politicized issue. I understand that it's an election year. I understand that it's 2020, but it feels disingenuous if you're looking at it from, and I'm not saying that President Trump's response was a good response. It wasn't. I totally agree with you that he should have come out and said, well, actually, yes, I was sort of briefed on this. Right now things are developing, whatever the response was, just admit the truth instead of saying I haven't been briefed on it, or shutting reporters down and saying no comment, because obviously this is out there. The New York Times has reported it on Monday. The AP report. I mean, there were lots of different media outlets that were reporting it, and the American people deserved an answer. The cat's out of the bag. But I think from a Republican standpoint, it feels once again like an opportunity. Like the Democrats have seized on this opportunity to paint things in a light that 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 feels very disingenuous, especially since a day earlier they were claiming that, they had nothing to say, that they may or may not have been briefed, and agreeing that the president may or may not have been briefed. There's a disconnect there, and it's hard to overcome that. But of course, I guess all is fair in love and war when it's an election year, and especially in 2020, this year seems to just get crazier and crazier. So I'm having to sort of like put things in the context of 2020, but I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around that, how this became such an issue. Now you have Democrats calling for investigations and committees investigate. It's just like another thing, another story. And I think that's why a lot of Republicans are dismissing this and aren't taking this as seriously as maybe they should, because it feels disingenuous.
When you say disingenuous, you mean like this is fake news designed to hurt the president, or I'm not sure what you mean by that.
No. 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 And I don't think that all of this is a hoax. But I think what happened was, all of the people above, including the president, were caught. I think the New York Times, published this story, probably shouldn't have published the story because they didn't have all of the information and all of the facts. And it was a developing situation, at least it sounds this way based on what I've heard from Democrats, what I've heard from Republicans. And they had to say something, and they said the wrong thing. They kind of like push things down the road or kick the can down the road. And I think what feels disingenuous is that initially this was the response from Democrats. And I'm not saying that they should have been leaders on this. I mean, obviously the president and his spokesperson, Kayleigh McEnany, should have copped this and said, yes, this is an ongoing situation. And some of that started to kind of come out as the week went on. And also Kayleigh McEnany did a poor job of sticking to one story. She said that the president had been briefed and then hadn't been briefed, and it felt very disorganized. But I think in the chaos of all of this, when Democrat leaders, and I'm thinking of Nancy Pelosi, I'm thinking of Adam Schiff, initially said that they didn't have a comment and that this was a developing situation and that it's possible the president hadn't been briefed. All of a sudden, within a matter of 24 hours, it's like they circled the wagons and they said, "Oh, we're going to make this an issue." And all of a sudden, it went from 0 to 100. And really, this was an opportunity for the right and the left, I think, to probably unite on something that looks very damning for Russian officials and for these these intelligence officials. And I feel like that didn't happen. And I guess that's where my disconnect is.
No, that definitely didn't happen. That's for sure. I totally agree with you on that. So yeah. But I obviously I hope that this is, the relevant intelligence authorities pursue this, and if there is a strong evidence that this did in fact happen, I hope that there will be repercussions, very strong repercussions. Though we'll see about that, I suppose. So, it was a big week for the Supreme Court. I don't know how much we're going to get to, but there were a trio actually of cases. And so where do you want to start with that, Kristen?
So, you want to start with, I guess we'll start with June Medical Services versus Russo. That's the Louisiana abortion law case.
Absolutely.
Okay. Because that was kind of that took a lot of attention up at the beginning of the week. But so there were 3 big SCOTUS cases that kind of came down over the course of the week. And again, with everything going on, they didn't make as much news as some of the other juicier, I guess, news stories. But these are really, anytime a SCOTUS decision comes down, I take notice because it's, the implications in terms of policy are usually so far reaching. So this decision came down on Monday. So the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 vote, and by the way, that'll be a theme in all 3 of these cases, the 5-4 vote, always decided by Chief Justice Roberts. He's always in the hot seat. Yeah. So in a Supreme Court 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court decided to strike down a Louisiana law requiring abortion providers to have admitting privileges at local hospitals, claiming that this had placed an undue burden on patients who were seeking abortion. So regarding this case, abortion rights activists said from the start that the law could lead to all but one abortion provider in the state of Louisiana being shut down. And this would also make legal abortions inaccessible. It would endanger women's health. And anti-abortion activists concluded that the ruling was a knock on not just the pro-life movement, but on the issue of state sovereignty. So this was sort of the argument going back and forth. And I should note before we get into it that that this ruling relied on precedent, which again, Chief Justice Roberts tends to kind of go with precedent, at least lately. He's very tied to that. And in this case, there was an almost identical case out of Texas in 2016 that dealt with similar issues, and so that was what he relied on for his what came down to his decision. So I don't know. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think that the votes of 8 of the 9 justices were entirely predictable, and Chief Justice Roberts' vote was unusual, very unusual, because this is, as you pointed out, the Hellerstedt decision was 2016, so it's a very recent precedent. And the facts of the case are incredibly on point to this Louisiana case. And so what the Chief Justice basically said is, stare decisis requires us to, uphold that decision. But the unusual part is that in that same opinion, Chief Justice Roberts said, but I disagreed with that not even 5-year-old precedent, but because it's a precedent, I'm going to uphold it. Now, one would think that, well, if you are going to overturn any precedent, it would be one that you disagreed with that's only a few years old. That's sort of the least strong of any sort of precedents. And so it's puzzling to a lot of people. And I think there are a couple of ways of looking at what Chief Justice Roberts did. And one is, you mentioned or alluded to it already, is that he has a great respect for precedent and judicial restraint and that sort of thing. And that's, in fact, what he argues, in his concurrence. Another way to look at it, though, is some people on the left have argued this, is that he's sort of playing a long game, if you will, in moving the court to the right or asserting the court's independence. And he doesn't want to send a message that, 2 Donald Trump presidential appointments automatically mean we're going to shift our views, stop on a dime, turn around on a dime, that sort of thing. And so I think it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. My sense of John Roberts is that he does have more respect for precedent than some of the much more activist judges on the court, and that's most of them. I mean, that's both on the left and the right. You have, for instance, Clarence Thomas, who said, we just need to overturn Roe. And he just basically flat out, essentially said that in his what he wrote. So I think there are a couple of really both of those things going on to the extent. I think just from a temperamental standpoint, John Roberts doesn't want to move the court too quickly. And it certainly wouldn't surprise me if he has some strategic motives for doing that as well. He certainly bristled when Donald Trump talked about, Obama judges and Trump judges and that sort of thing. So I guess there's a lot going on there. And I know I tend, even though I'm on the left, I tend to be a little less skeptical of Robert's motives than, say, Ken. And Ken and I have talked about this before. He just doesn't buy that at all. He thinks that John Roberts is playing a completely cynical game, and I don't necessarily agree with that, at least in its entirety. But one thing I wanted to ask you is that pretty clearly John Roberts has been a big disappointment to a lot of people on the right. And I'm wondering why you think that is. I'm kind of interested in your comment or your thoughts on the disappointment that is John Roberts, who's basically become sort of the slightly more right of center Anthony Kennedy.
I actually, when you were talking, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the fact that I have a lot of friends on the right who are even more right of me, or maybe less so, who feel that John Roberts has let them down. And, without sounding, I guess, too overreaching. I think one of the issues that we have in this country and just in the state of politics and society as it is right now is the fact that we don't like activist judges unless there are activist judges.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yep,
yeah.
Yep.
And I think you and I could definitely agree on that. And I think that one of the things that's hard as a Republican to do, and I'm sure it's hard as a Democrat too, is, if you're sort of this mindset that activist judges are bad no matter what, and that we shouldn't be appointing activist judges in the first place because it contradicts everything about, SCOTUS and everything about the judicial system as it was intended to be. I think it's hard to sort of wrap your head around the fact that sometimes, when somebody disappoints you, it's because they're not ruling the way you think that they should be ruling. But he's somehow getting around it, or it's somehow an excuse that he's relying on precedent. And I find that kind of disheartening. And I'm not saying Chief Justice Roberts is my favorite judge. He's not, but that tells you everything right there. He's not necessarily an activist judge. And I think the fact that we have predictability on both sides of the fact that we even have something, it's the fact that we can even say both sides of the court, and we don't know
Sure.
judges
Yeah.
typically rule, is disheartening in itself. If you're somebody who understands these truths about how SCOTUS was supposed to be and how the judicial branch was supposed to be. It's supposed to be as unbiased a branch as possible. They're supposed to be beholden to the law. So I think that's why Republicans, or I should say some Republicans, are so upset with Chief Justice John Roberts, because I think they expected him to be an activist judge in the same way that liberals and Democrats. A couple of months ago, there were a couple of rulings. Justice Ginsburg made a couple of rulings where she sided with the more conservative judges, and my Democrat friends were outraged. People who, there are books written about, these almost like folk hero type, kids books written about Justice Ginsburg, and all of a sudden, it seemed like all of a sudden they were turning on her, and I think this is what's going on. There's this disillusionment on the right with Roberts, and this, applause around, Justice Thomas, for example, and Kavanaugh for upholding these, activist ideals. And so that's where I think that comes from.
Yeah, I would say that John Roberts is absolutely the least activist of the judges on the conservative end of things on the court. And I wouldn't be surprised if he is maybe pretty close to just the least activist in general on the court. And I actually think that that's the sort of role you would ideally want for a Chief Justice. And I know that he takes that sort of role as being the Chief Justice and trying to build consensus and that sort of thing fairly seriously. And again, some people on the left are saying, "Oh, Mike, you're just so totally buying into his long-term plot to destroy the country and that sort of thing." But I don't know. I guess maybe I'm imputing more good faith to John Roberts than a lot of people on the left. I don't agree with him on policy on most issues, but I think he, to the extent that I could expect this of anyone on the courts, I think he tries to call them as fairly as he can, and that's basically the best I could hope for from a judge who I don't agree with in terms of policy and just general, political ideology. So there you go.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's funny because when you do read, SCOTUS blog, or, if you read these decisions, if they're ever written by Chief Justice Roberts, or, you see people opining about decisions that were made and he wrote the opinion, for example, you often see right up front, people say, well, once again, he agreed with precedent. Once again, he went with precedent. Once again, he looked at this case, that case. And I think that tells you a lot about him, not necessarily good or bad, but like you said, he respects precedent. And rather than being somebody who hides behind it necessarily, which is what I think a lot of people on the right are saying, I think it's just something he uses as he makes these decisions. He obviously he doesn't let his personal feelings get in the way of making those decisions, he sort of removes as much bias as he possibly can. You can't remove all of it, but he removes as much of it as possible, and he relies on precedent. And he's very quick to say when he like in this case, in this opinion, he's very quick to say that he doesn't necessarily agree with these decisions, but he relies on the precedent. And so, I think he's going to continue to be a pretty controversial figure on both the right and the left. I don't know.
Yeah,
I guess.
Absolutely. So, I think we probably have time to talk about one more Supreme Court ruling. We won't get to the whole trio, but because obviously we said there were three big ones, and the other one maybe we could talk about a little bit is on funding, sort of indirectly, of religious organizations.
Yeah, Espinoza versus Montana. So this is a case that came from Montana. And again, going with our 5-4 vote theme and reliance on precedent, this sort of continues that theme, I guess you could say. So this was largely seen as a win for advocates of religious freedom. The Supreme Court ruled by a 5-4 vote that the Montana Supreme Court violated the free exercise clause when it applied a state constitutional no-aid provision to bar religious schools from receiving scholarship money under a state tax credit program. And of course, it overturned this ruling. Critics were claiming that religious schools were unfairly benefiting from this special income tax program that was going on. And this helped fund nonprofit scholarship organizations to help low-income families pay for private school education. So it's funny because you had, I think that this kind of just speaks to the fact that Chief Justice Roberts really isn't necessarily an activist judge or in the tank for the conservative side. And this is one of those things that I think frustrates and confounds a lot of conservatives, is the fact that, well, you ruled this way on this, but then using the same set of rules, you ruled, in sort of this conservative win, which frustrated a lot of Democrats, I think, but in this sort of win for religious freedom. And so, I think it just, I don't know, I think it demonstrates his lack of judicial activism, if anything else, in light of in light of the other decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the majority did make the right call here. I think people who disagree, and plenty of folks on the left disagree with this decision, and obviously 4 justices did, that tend to point to the Establishment Clause, which of course prohibits the establishment of religion. And that doesn't mean just not formally establishing a state religion, but any sort of program or funding that promotes religion. But I don't think that this violates the Establishment Clause, because the Montana legislature here wasn't giving money to religious schools. Now, had they been giving money directly to religious schools, I think then that would have not been constitutionally okay, and that would have been a violation of the Establishment Clause. But instead, the legislature was giving a tax credit to people who contributed to a tuition scholarship program that all private schools, religious or non-religious, were eligible for. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that the majority, I think around 70% of private schools in Montana, have a religious affiliation, that's immaterial in my view. Because the First Amendment, at least the religion parts of the First Amendment, is designed, in my reading, to ensure that there's no special treatment for religion, certainly, but also to ensure that people were able to practice their religion without interference. That's, of course, the Free Exercise Clause, so long as they don't, infringe on the rights or safety of other people. But the First Amendment was absolutely not intended to put religious institutions at a disadvantage solely because they're religious. And so not allowing religious schools to take advantage of this program, which had no specifically religious promoting purpose, I think that would in effect be doing that. And so that's why I think that this was the right decision. And also there was a view expressed on the minority that, well, the court shouldn't have taken this up because there's no longer a live issue before them because the program had been ended. But as Chief Justice Roberts pointed out in his opinion, the program wasn't actually ended by the legislature, but by the Montana Supreme Court, based on a state law that, in his view, and I think the majority's view correctly, expressly discriminates on the basis of religion. And so, to me, I get why people are, on the left are upset about this, but it seems to me that this was in fact the right decision here.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it perfectly. I was going to add the point that you made where, I think if this was a situation where this provision was being made, that money was actually being given to religious schools, I think we would have a whole other case, but that wasn't the case. And I think a lot of critics of this decision were kind of conflating those two things from what I see, which, happens anytime you have people who are opining over a Supreme Court decision. I think sometimes they're quick to compare it to, other cases which take precedent, or they're quick to conflate issues. And I think that was sort of the clincher here, was that this tax credit was being given to I guess the families of students, and that was the primary issue. And I also thought that this was a proper ruling. Last night at dinner, I was talking, my husband's an attorney, and we were talking about this case. I just asked him, I knew I was going to have to prep this story and create an intro, and I asked him about it, and we got into a discussion about just what you mentioned about the fact that the way this country was founded, and it wasn't founded. It was basically founded on this idea that people would come here seeking religious freedom, and that you're free to practice religion, or you're also free not to practice religion, and that's it's something that's very personal. It's a personal choice, and it's something that's protected, and I feel like it was further protected by this ruling. I was happy with it, because I'm a big fan of religious freedom, to practice it or not practice it.
Yeah, I don't. Though I got to say, though, it sort of, I won't call it a reach exactly, saying that somehow that this program, or abolishing this program, or eliminating the Catholic schools or whatever, it's mostly Catholic schools, somehow interferes with free exercise of religion. That doesn't necessarily track as well for me, but I do think it was discriminatory on the basis of religion, and that's not okay. So yeah, that's just a quibble anyway. So yeah, why don't we close with some recommendations for this week? I can start, I guess. So why don't I start?
Yeah,
In fact,
go ahead.
I have some very date appropriate. Now, a lot of people hear this after, I'm sure, Independence Day, but if you are hearing this on Independence Day, I'm gonna have my recommendations that are very on point. One is, a lot of folks were talking about Disney Plus showing Hamilton, right? And if you don't have Disney Plus, of course, you don't get that. But I saw on Facebook somebody saying, "Well, yeah, what about 1776?" And my heart warmed, because 1776 is one of my favorite patriotic sort of movies. I've watched it most
awesome. It's awesome.
most every 4th of July for God knows how many years. I have the soundtrack. I know all the songs by heart, and it just warms my heart. And so that is my recommendation. If you've never seen, now, if you're a certain type of person, you're going to find it just unbelievably corny. But I think, Independence Day is about unbelievably corny in a way, and in a good way, I think. But, and so that is my sort of fun recommendation. My more serious recommendation related to that is that watching 1776 when I was very young sort of made me a huge fan of John Adams, who's kind of like my first presidential crush, if you will. Kind of John Adams and TR are kind of the two presidents I love the most. But I read God knows how many biographies of John Adams, and there are a couple I want to recommend. One is John Adams, A Life, by a guy named John Ferling, and I'm recommending this one over the David McCullough one, which I read as well, but everyone knows David McCullough's biography. And I think it's good, but it wasn't the best one. I think Ferling's is a bit better. And if you really want to go old school, back in 1962, Page Smith did a 2-volume biography of John Adams, which is amazing. I bought a copy, God, 20-something years ago, and then I don't know what happened to it. I lost it, and just yesterday I was thinking, whatever happened to that? And I went on and looked for a used copy, and I found a copy of it for like $5 plus shipping, and I was just such a happy guy. So there still are used copies out there. That is the definitive biography of John Adams, a great American, not so great of a president, but he was a great patriot and a great American, and kind of a disappointment as a president. But anyway, those are my recommendations for this week. Yeah. What about you, Kristen?
I agree with you about John Adams, actually.
Cool.
It's funny because the last few times that I've made recommendations, I've recommended more, I guess, more serious books and sort of, heavy material that I found interesting. And today I kind of wanted to depart from that and recommend something really super, I guess, lighthearted and something I've been enjoying with my family. And that's the Netflix show The Floor is Lava. Have you heard of this?
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it though.
It's so much fun. So, it's one of those shows that, like, if you have kids, if you don't have kids, the whole family can get into it. You could easily, I have friends without kids who watch it and get into it, but it's basically just a hilarious show on Netflix, and it's gotten a lot of buzz. I decided to, okay, I'll watch it, and we tuned in and we laughed. We thought it was funny. We attempted to play The Floor is Lava in our living room as we were watching the show. So it was just sort of a nice diversion from everything going on over the last few weeks. And if you need a break from the news, that's good. And then the other thing I wanted to suggest really quickly is, again, this isn't political in any way, but there's a writer who's been making headlines lately. I believe it's his fourth book that just came out. His name is Riley Sager. It's actually a pen name for, I don't know what his real name is, but the writer's name is Riley Sager. And he just came out earlier this week with a new book. He writes sort of like these haunted house mysteries with great twisty endings that are just not serious and fun and quick to read. And his latest book is called Home Before Dark. I'm about halfway through it right now. I downloaded it the day it came out, which was like midweek. And I'll tell you what, I've just been zooming through it, and it's such a cool diversion. If you like haunted house type mysteries and twisty endings, and he's been compared to like Alfred Hitchcock, which is, I don't know, and as a mystery lover, in my opinion, that's like the highest compliment you can give anybody. But his stuff is pretty cool, and it's just a fun diversion. So if you haven't checked out Riley Sager's books or The Floor is Lava, you should check those out.
All right. Yeah, sounds interesting. And, we are out of time for today, but if you are a supporter, we're going to have a midweek show where we talk about, we're going to talk about another big Supreme Court case, one near and dear to my heart, because I, as longtime listeners know, I love the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. My favorite thing about Dodd-Frank, which I sort of liked, but anyway, there's a big ruling about that, and also, Kristen, I know something that's very near and dear to your heart, Facebook and the big Facebook boycott and everything surrounding that. I have some thoughts on that. Maybe something that'll be surprising to a few people. We might get into, there's another book apparently about here's a shock, dysfunction in the Trump family that may be coming out at the end of this month. And who knows, we might get to a few other things here and there, but that it will be waiting for you. Well, not waiting for you, but that will be there for you midweek if you are a supporter. And if you're not a supporter, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys and you can sign up. And there's all kinds of other good stuff, various levels of support, not just more content. That's, I know, the main thing that people come there for. And of course, if you cannot afford to, help us out there financially, we totally get that. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I'll get you set up with full access to all of our content. And also, one thing that everyone can afford is just to subscribe to the show, leave ratings and reviews, and especially sharing is a big, big help. So if you could share favorite episodes, that kind of thing on social media, that would definitely help us out. And of course, if you just generally want to get in touch with us to say hi, or you have a question, comment, that sort of thing, mail@politicsguys.com. And there's our bipartisan politics subreddit, which you all know about at this point, our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, and Chris Wilkerson. Today's show is produced by us, Mike and Kristen, and we'll be back with a new show for you next week. We hope you'll join us.